FlatOut 1 was very good. So good in fact that it got a sequel, FlatOut 2. FlatOut 2 is seen as the best game in the franchise. But is it actually the best game in the franchise? Well, let's see. Hi everyone, as always Patrick here. If you're already subscribed, make sure you turn on notifications, otherwise YouTube won't tell you if I posted anything. If you are new to the channel, make sure you watch until the very end and consider subscribing if you like it. Okay, FlatOut 2. Just like FlatOut 1, FlatOut 2 was developed by Bugbear Entertainment and published by Empire Interactive, at least in Europe, in 2006. Since I have nothing to say about the developers, let's talk about the graphics. FlatOut 2 definitely looks better than FlatOut 1. However, when you compare FlatOut 2 to other racing games that also came out in 2006, you will quickly notice that FlatOut 2 doesn't look that good graphically. It looks good, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't look that good. FlatOut 2 does have good texture quality, good LOD, and nice particle effects, but the graphics have some issues. First of all, the game has a lot of bloom. Because of this, sometimes it's actually hard to see where you're going. Second of all, the game has motion blur, and the motion blur was very poorly implemented in this game. The motion blur in FlatOut 2 doesn't even look like motion blur. When you reach high speeds, everything becomes blurry, even the car. And most importantly, third of all, the game has a yellow filter. Yeah, it's one of those games. Back in the mid-2000s, late 2000s, and even early 2010s, every single developer wanted to implement some sort of filter. Brown filter, gray filter, yellow filter, it didn't matter. A filter was a requirement. I blame Need for Speed Most Wanted 2005 for this. Need for Speed Most Wanted 2005 plagued the racing game genre with this filter. Honestly, I'm glad that the filter days are gone. Okay, but what's the problem with the yellow filter in this game? It makes the entire game look ugly. Combine this with bloom and a poorly implemented motion blur, and you get poorly aged graphics. Don't get me wrong, there are moments where FlatOut 2 actually looks pretty good, but man, the bloom, the motion blur, the yellow filter, all of those things combined make FlatOut 2 look kinda ugly at times. To prove my point, let's compare FlatOut 2 to other racing games that also came out in 2006. Toka Race Driver 3, Sprint Car Challenge, Unwheel, and of course, Expand Rally Extreme. FlatOut 2 looks better than Sprint Car Challenge, and Unwheel, unsurprisingly, looks a tiny bit worse than Toka Race Driver 3, and it definitely looks worse than Expand Rally Extreme. Not to mention, Expand Rally Extreme doesn't have that yellow filter, and Expand Rally Extreme also has better bloom and better motion blur. But then again, Expand Rally Extreme does everything better, so maybe this comparison isn't fair. Alright, let's move on. What about the graphical options of FlatOut 2? Well, FlatOut 2 supports widescreen resolutions, there's anisotropic filtering, there's anti-aliasing, there's VSync, and the game supports high frame rates, so the gameplay is going to be smooth. So what's the catch? FlatOut 2 runs on the updated version of the Romu engine, the engine Bugbear uses. Yet somehow, someway, FlatOut 2, just like FlatOut 1, suffers from the same problems. Firstly, the widescreen resolutions are stretched from the 4:3 aspect ratio, at least in the retail release. Secondly, the VSync is forced on by default, and that can mess with your controls. Thirdly, the frame rate is capped at 100 FPS, and most importantly, there's no FOV slider. Thankfully, almost all of those issues can be fixed with one simple fix: the Zolika patch. The Zolika patch removes forced VSync and the 100 FPS cap, fixes the zoomed in FOV and the stretched HUD elements, and scaling in widescreen resolutions, and more. But why almost every issue and not every issue? Because of the FOV. There is a better way to fix the FOV, and that way is by installing 13AG's fix. All you have to do is install 13AG's fix, then edit the FlatOut 2 widescreen fix ini file, and then set the FOV factor to the desired value. But if you don't care about the FOV that much, you can simply use the Zolika patch and leave it at that. Lastly, what about the game's stability? Well, the game didn't crash, didn't stutter, didn't lag, and it worked fine. Or should I say, it worked as intended. So overall, this is a decent PC release, but it has some issues. Now let's talk about the story. There's no story. I would complain about this, but I actually really want to talk about the gameplay. So I'll just talk about the gameplay. And I have a lot to say about the gameplay. If you've watched my FlatOut 1 video, then you already know how this video is gonna go. Let's start with the damage model. Just like in FlatOut 1, the damage model in FlatOut 2 is very good, if not better. Your car still gets dents, scratches, the parts are still flying off, the windows can still be broken, and most importantly, your driver can still fly through the front windshield if you crash into something hard enough. But now, crashing is more spectacular. When you crash into stuff, there are now sparks flying everywhere, and the deformation is much better. Speaking of better, smashing into your opponents is now way more fun. In FlatOut 1, smashing into your opponents was fun, but the smashing was also kinda weird in a way. Because in FlatOut 1, when you smashed into an opponent, somehow your opponent didn't take much damage. In fact, you took more damage even though you crashed into your opponent. FlatOut 2 is a completely different story. Now you can perform hit and run tactics, since smashing into your opponents doesn't slow you down that much. Not to mention, now when you smash into an opponent, your opponent takes way more damage than you do, not the other way around. This makes smashing into stuff fun, intense, and exciting. Also, smashing into props and other objects is also way more fun now. In FlatOut 1, everything behaved like a physics object. Props, normal objects, and even your car. But in FlatOut 2, again, it's a completely different story. Objects and props still behave like physics objects, but now your car is like a brick wall to those props and physics objects. Hitting objects and props no longer slows you down. You also get more boosts from hitting objects in FlatOut 2 compared to FlatOut 1. This greatly improves the general flow of the game, because like I've said before, all of those improvements make racing in FlatOut 2 more fun, intense, and exciting. Now let's talk about the physics. The physics in FlatOut 2 have been greatly improved. Firstly, there's no auto balance, just like in FlatOut 1. This means that you can get excellent rollovers and flips because the game isn't trying to get your car back on all four wheels. Secondly, the cars are heavy, but now the cars are heavy in an arcadey kind of way. You can still throw the weight of your car around the corners, but now it's less exaggerated and less over the top. This means that turning and even driving in a straight line feels more accurate to real life. And thirdly, the physics feel way more balanced. The game knows when the physics should be more accurate to real life and when the physics should be more exaggerated and over the top. You can easily notice this every time you use a ramp. When you jump off a ramp, the physics become more exaggerated and over the top. And when you're driving normally on a flat surface, the physics become more realistic. Now let's talk about the handling. Just like the physics, the handling in FlatOut 2 is greatly improved. Like I've said before, there's no auto balance, so you can get excellent rollovers and flips. But the handling also feels lighter compared to FlatOut 1. But that's because FlatOut 2 is much more arcadey compared to FlatOut 1. So technically the handling and the cars are still heavy, but you just don't notice it all that much. Cars are planted to the ground, drifting and turning feels smooth, and the handling also feels different compared to FlatOut 1. And I'm saying that in a good way. It's smoother, more fluid, and most importantly, much more arcadey and less tight. So you don't have to worry about skidding out of control anymore. So in other words, the biggest change when it comes to handling is the tire grip. The cars are now much more controllable compared to FlatOut 1. All of this makes the handling great, but what about the cars and the tracks? The cars are, well, I'll put it this way. In FlatOut 1, you were racing in derby cars and muscle cars throughout the entire game. In FlatOut 2, you're not using muscle cars at all, and you're also not using derby cars. At least not the ones with liveries. In FlatOut 2, you are still using derby cars, but those derby cars are more normal and not official, again, liveries. But the game also has two different car classes. There are also race cars and the street cars. So there are 3 car classes in total: derby, race and street. This means that the game is themed more on the street racing / the import tuner scene than its predecessor. Every single car class, and every single car for that matter, handles differently. Every car in this game can be upgraded in many ways. You can upgrade their top speed, the acceleration, the durability, and so much more. Also, did I say that those cars are so fun to drive? I can't even explain why. This is something that you just have to see for yourself. What about the tracks? In FlatOut 1, the tracks were technical, tight turns and narrow roads. But in FlatOut 2, once again, it's a completely different story. The track design in FlatOut 2 is much more simplistic. Tight turns are almost non-existent, and the tracks are wide. This means that the sense of speed is automatically better compared to FlatOut 1 simply because you can reach high speeds more often. And also because you don't have to constantly brake just to make a turn. My favorite track in the game is the canals track, for the reasons I've talked about just a second ago. Now it's time to talk about the other good qualities of the game. 1. Getting nitro is much easier compared to FlatOut 1. In FlatOut 1, nitro was hard to come by, but in FlatOut 2, say it with me, it's a completely different story. Like I've said before, in FlatOut 2 hitting objects and props don't slow you down as much. Those objects and props also give you more nitro compared to FlatOut 1, and you can now get nitro by jumping off a ramp. In FlatOut 1 you couldn't get nitro by jumping off a ramp, so this is a huge game changer. 2. FlatOut 2 has more content, more cars, more tracks, and more minigames to be exact. I think this good quality is self-explanatory, so I'll just move on to the next one. 3. This game has a great and memorable soundtrack. It features a lot of well-known bands: Rise Against, Rob Zombie, Papa Roach, Nickelback. Yeah, but still, the soundtrack is great and memorable. And 4. This is a 3-in-1 good quality. In FlatOut 1, you were racing against nobodies. In FlatOut 2, you are racing against actual characters. When you drive near an opponent, the name is shown in the lower left corner with the character's face on the left side of the name. Opponents now have a health bar affected by damaging the opponent's car. If the car's health empties, the car will explode and push the opponent from the windshield at the same time. Derby mode mechanics are also improved, mainly because of those things I've just talked about. I could also talk about other good qualities and improvements, but the video is already long enough, so I'm just gonna move on. Now it's time to talk about that one thing I really don't wanna talk about: the bad qualities of FlatOut 2. Believe it or not, FlatOut 2 does have bad qualities. But don't worry, this section will be short. 1. The tracks no longer have tight turns compared to its predecessor. This makes the races too dependent on the performance of the car instead of skill. 2. Some cars do not have all upgrades just because they appear early in game. 3. Turns have no sense of speed. 4. Objects and props don't always give nitro on hitting. And 5. The worst bad quality. The opponents can be annoying at times. Not difficult, just annoying. So, with all that said, would I say that FlatOut 2 is the best game in the franchise? Oh boy, I don't even wanna say it because I just know that I will get backlash for this. But you know what? Someone's gotta say it. No, FlatOut 2 is not the best game in the franchise Because there are two FlatOut games better than this. Yeah, I said it. What are you gonna do about it, huh? Before you leave a hate comment, please hear me out, because right now I'm going to say why I said that. So I did say that there are two FlatOut games that I think are better than FlatOut 2. One of those games is FlatOut 1. Yes, I know I did say that FlatOut 2 is an improvement in almost every aspect, but FlatOut 1 has things that FlatOut 2 doesn't. FlatOut 1 has more interesting handling, also more realistic handling, more interesting tracks and more interesting track design, and also snowy courses. Those are things that you just can't find in FlatOut 2. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but I will take more interesting and more realistic handling, more interesting tracks and snowy courses any day of the week. As for the other game that I think is better than FlatOut 2, well, you'll just have to wait for my next analysis video. That's all I'm gonna say. But there's also one more reason why I think that way. It's because of you. Yes, you, the FlatOut 2 fans. Or should I say the FlatOut 2 glazers. You're glazing this game so hard that it's unhealthy. I bet if your physical copy of FlatOut 2 had a hole in it, you would stick your exhaust pipe into it, and then you would do something freaky to that copy. I don't even want to think about it, to be honest. Not only that, you also attack everyone that says FlatOut 2 isn't the best game in the franchise. Seriously, stop attacking people for that. Thanks to your behavior, we can't have a normal discussion about FlatOut games anymore. I hope you're proud of yourself. I am incredibly sorry for that rant. But hey, someone had to say it. Now if you'll excuse me, I'm going to barricade myself from an angry mob that has suddenly appeared out my window. Also, FlatOut 2 is amazing. Please play it, you won't regret it. Up next, FlatOut Ultimate Carnage.